Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Great to be here, Chris, and today we are digging into what might be the single largest coordinated technology investment any country has ever announced. South Korea is putting roughly $880 billion behind chips, data centers, robotics, and artificial intelligence over the next 10 years.
$880 billion is a number so enormous, it almost stops meaning anything. So help me put it into some kind of human perspective. What exactly did the South Korean government announce here? And when did this actually happen?
The announcement landed at the end of June 2026, and the framing really matters here. This is not one giant government check. It is the government coordinating about 1,350 trillion won in planned private investment from national champions like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, stretched across a full decade.
That coordination point is interesting because a skeptic might argue the government is simply taking credit for money that Samsung and SK were going to spend anyway. How much of this is genuinely new spending versus a clever repackaging of existing corporate roadmaps?
That is exactly the right skeptical question, and the honest answer is that it is some of both. Part of this builds on spending already in motion, but the government's role in fast-tracking permits, guaranteeing power, and arranging financing incentives is new and significant.
Okay, so walk me through the actual components, because I imagine $880 billion does not just go into one giant pile. Where is the money actually flowing? And which pieces of the AI stack does it touch?
There are three big buckets that stand out. First, Samsung Group and SK Group each plan to build two brand new chip fabrication plants in the country's southwest, worth a combined 800 trillion won. Second, there is a 550 trillion won push into AI data centers. Third, there is a robotics and broader ecosystem layer wrapped around everything.
Let us start with those fabrication plants, because 4 new fabs is a staggering amount of manufacturing capacity. What are they actually going to make in those facilities, and why does that matter so much for artificial intelligence specifically?
The headline product is memory, specifically high bandwidth memory, the specialized stacked memory that sits right next to AI accelerator chips. Every serious AI training system on the planet is starving for it, and Korea already dominates global supply through SK Hynix and Samsung.
That is a fascinating strategic choice, because most of the headlines in this industry go to the companies designing processors or building frontier models. Korea seems to be betting on a completely different layer of the stack. Is that a strength or a vulnerability?
I would argue it is both, honestly. The strength is that memory is a genuine choke point, because you simply cannot build a modern AI cluster without high bandwidth memory. And there are essentially only 3 companies on Earth that make it well. The vulnerability is that memory has historically been a brutally cyclical business with punishing boom and bust swings.
Right, and anyone who has followed the memory industry over the decades knows those down cycles can be absolutely devastating, with prices collapsing 70 or 80%. What happens to this grand plan if the AI demand curve flattens out halfway through the decade?
That is the trillion-won question, quite literally. The bet embedded in this plan is that AI compute demand keeps compounding for 10 straight years, which would smooth out the traditional memory cycle. If demand stalls, Korea ends up with gleaming overcapacity. But if demand holds, they own one of the most valuable industrial positions in the world.
Let us move to the second bucket you mentioned, the data centers, because that number alone was $356 billion, if I read it correctly. Who is actually building those facilities, and what kind of scale are we talking about?
The data center push is backed by 550 trillion won from SK Group, GS Group, and Naver, which is Korea's homegrown internet giant. The stated goal is 8.4 gigawatts of AI data center capacity by 2029, and then another 10 gigawatts layered on top of that by 2035.
Those gigawatt figures deserve a pause, because I think listeners hear these power numbers constantly without any sense of scale. Give me something concrete to anchor on. What does 18 gigawatts of data center capacity actually compare to in the real world?
A useful anchor is that 1 gigawatt is roughly the output of a large nuclear reactor. So we are talking about the equivalent of 18 nuclear reactors dedicated entirely to running artificial intelligence workloads. For a country of about 52 million people, that is a genuinely astonishing commitment of national energy infrastructure to a single technology.
And that raises the obvious follow-up question about where all of that electricity is actually going to come from, because South Korea is not exactly swimming in spare generation capacity. Does the plan address the power problem, or is that being hand-waved away?
It is addressed, though this is where execution risk feels highest to me. Korea SA hoards nearly all its energy inputs, so the plan leans on new nuclear builds, grid expansion, and siting data centers near the new fabs. Synchronizing power plants and chip factories on one timeline is a monumental challenge.
You mentioned earlier that the government's real contribution is coordination rather than cash. And this power question makes that concrete. Compare this for me to how the United States is handling the same problem, because we covered American grid struggles on this show not long ago.
The contrast is really stark. In the United States, you have regulators essentially refereeing fights between data center developers and utilities, with projects waiting years in interconnection queues. Korea is attempting the opposite model, where the state plans the fabs, the data centers, and the power as one integrated national project with aligned timelines from day one.
That integrated approach sounds efficient on paper, but centrally coordinated industrial policy has a decidedly mixed historical track record around the world. What makes anyone confident that Korea can actually pull off something this sprawling without it collapsing into bureaucratic dysfunction?
Fair challenge, but Korea arguably has the best track record on Earth for exactly this playbook. The country built world-leading shipbuilding, steel, automobiles, and semiconductors through coordinated state and chaebol partnerships. Whatever you think of that model politically, betting against Korea's ability to execute industrial policy has historically been a losing wager.
For listeners who do not know the term, the chaebols are those giant family-controlled conglomerates like Samsung, SK, and LG that dominate the Korean economy. Does this plan deepen their dominance? And is that concentration itself a risk worth talking about?
It absolutely deepens it, and yes, that concentration cuts both ways. When Samsung and SK thrive, Korea thrives, but the national economy becomes even more of a leveraged bet on a handful of boardrooms. Roughly a fifth of Korean exports already come from semiconductors alone, and this plan pushes that concentration meaningfully higher over the coming decade.
Let us zoom out to the global picture, because this announcement does not exist in a vacuum. How does $880 billion stack up against the other giant AI infrastructure commitments we have seen, like the American Stargate project or Europe's investment programs?
This is where the numbers get genuinely wild. Stargate in the United States was framed around $500 billion, and Europe's Invest AI program targeted around 200 billion euros. Korea's plan is nominally bigger than both, but the real shock is proportionality, because Korea's entire annual economic output is only about $1.8 trillion.
Hold on, let me actually do that math out loud, because if the economy produces $1.8 trillion a year and the plan is $880 billion over 10 years, that is roughly 5% of national output every single year for a decade.
Exactly right, and I love that you did the arithmetic, because that ratio is the single most important fact in this whole story. Adjusted for the size of its economy, South Korea is making a commitment to AI infrastructure that is several times more aggressive than anything the United States or China has publicly announced.
That level of national commitment feels less like an industrial policy and more like a wartime mobilization, honestly. What is driving that urgency? Why does Seoul apparently believe this is an existential moment rather than just another attractive market opportunity?
A few forces are converging at once. Korea watched Japan's electronics industry lose its crown a generation ago and is determined not to repeat that story. China is pouring resources into memory chips to erode Korea's lead. Taiwan dominates logic manufacturing, and the demographic math of a shrinking workforce makes productivity through AI and robotics feel existential.
The demographic point is one I want to linger on, because Korea has one of the lowest birth rates ever recorded anywhere in the world. Explain the connection you are drawing between a shrinking population and this massive bet on artificial intelligence and robotics.
Korea's fertility rate has hovered around 0.7 children per woman, which means each generation is roughly one-third the size of the one before it. When your workforce is mathematically guaranteed to shrink, the only path to sustained economic growth is making each remaining worker dramatically more productive. And that is precisely what AI and robotics promise.
So in a strange way, the robotics bucket of this plan might be the most strategically revealing piece, even though it gets the least attention in the coverage. What do we actually know about the robotics component and how it fits the bigger picture?
The robotics layer is about physical AI, meaning humanoid robots, factory automation, and embodied intelligence deployed across manufacturing. Korea already runs the highest robot density in the world, with over 1,000 robots per 10,000 manufacturing workers. The plan treats robotics as the demand side that consumes the chips and the intelligence the rest of the stack produces.
That vertical integration story is elegant, where the same country makes the memory, hosts the compute, and deploys the robots. But let me play devil's advocate one more time, because Korea has famously struggled to produce world-class software and frontier AI models. Does hardware dominance even matter without the models?
This is the deepest strategic debate inside the whole announcement. The Korean thesis says models are becoming commoditized, with open weight systems closing the gap on frontier labs, while the physical substrate of memory, fabs, and power stays scarce and defensible. If that thesis is correct, owning the hardware layer is actually the better long-term position.
And if the thesis is wrong, the counterargument writes itself. Because the fattest profit margins in this industry currently sit with the model builders and the chip designers, not with the manufacturers doing the hardest capital-intensive work. History suggests commodity manufacturers get squeezed eventually.
True, but high-bandwidth memory has been behaving less like a commodity and more like a strategic bottleneck lately. SK Hynix has essentially sold out its production capacity years in advance, with customers prepaying to reserve supply. When buyers are begging and prepaying, you have pricing power that ordinary commodity manufacturers can only dream about.
Let us talk about the geopolitical wrinkle here, because none of this happens in a neutral world. Korea sits in a delicate position between the United States, which is its security ally, and China, which has long been its largest trading partner. How does this plan navigate that tension?
Very carefully is the short answer. The new fabs keep Korea's most advanced production capacity on home soil rather than offshoring it, which pleases Washington's supply chain hawks while preserving Seoul's own leverage. Korea has watched chip export controls become weapons of statecraft, and the clear lesson it drew was that owning irreplaceable capacity is the only durable protection.
There's also an interesting talent dimension to this, because building 4 fabs and gigawatts of data centers requires armies of engineers. With that shrinking population we discussed, where do the human beings who actually build and run all of this come from?
That may quietly be the binding constraint on the whole plan. Korea is expanding semiconductor engineering programs, opening immigration pathways for specialists, and betting AI-assisted design tools multiply each engineer's output. But every chip-building nation is chasing the same talent pool, so poaching wars are constant.
I want to bring this home for our listeners who are not policy wonks or semiconductor investors. If this plan works even partially as designed, what does the average technology user or business leader actually notice differently over the next 5 years or so?
The most tangible effect would be relief in the compute supply crunch, because more memory and more data center capacity eventually means cheaper and more available AI services for everyone. Every business paying for AI inference today is indirectly paying a scarcity premium, and Korea is essentially volunteering to spend a fortune to shrink that premium globally.
That is a helpful way to frame it, that one country's industrial policy becomes everyone else's price cut. But there must be losers in this scenario too. Who should be nervous when they read about 18 gigawatts and 4 new fabs coming online in Korea?
Competing memory makers like Micron face a capacity arms race they must match or concede. And Chinese memory upstarts see the moat they were trying to cross getting wider. I would also watch second-tier cloud providers, because a world of abundant Korean compute could compress the margins they currently enjoy from scarcity pricing.
There is a version of this story where a decade from now, we look back and say, this announcement was the moment the AI hardware race became a genuinely multipolar competition rather than a purely American and Chinese affair. Do you buy that framing?
I mostly do, and I would add that it pressures other middle powers to declare their own positions. Japan is already subsidizing Rapidus and TSMC facilities, the Gulf states are buying compute at sovereign scale, and India is courting fabs. Korea just raised the table stakes for what a serious national AI strategy looks like.
Before we wrap up, give me the bear case in one clean statement, because we have been fairly impressed by the ambition here, and I want listeners to hold both possibilities in their heads at the same time.
The bear case is simple and sobering. Korea is committing half a year of national output to infrastructure for a demand curve nobody can guarantee. Powered by electricity it has not yet generated. Staffed by engineers it has not yet trained in a memory market famous for vicious cycles. If AI demand disappoints, this becomes a monument to overreach.
And the bull case, stated just as cleanly so we can leave people with the honest shape of the debate, rather than a tidy verdict that pretends the uncertainty away.
The bull case is that compute is the oil of this century. Korea already refines its scarcest ingredient, and this plan locks in a decade of dominance right as the world's appetite becomes insatiable. In that world, this is the best national investment since the interstate highways. And everyone else spends the 30s playing catch-up.
What a story, and honestly, what a moment for a country of 52 million people to plant a flag this large in the middle of the defining technology race of our era. Any final thought before we sign off for today?
Just one, which is that we spend so much time on this show covering models and chatbots. And days like today remind us that underneath every clever AI product sits an unglamorous world of concrete, silicon, and electricity. Whoever masters that physical layer quietly shapes what everyone else gets to build on top of it.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.